It's Tuesday, the 28th January 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper, the leading story. Afenifere, Khan, others oppose push for Sharia in Southwest. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, PDP crisis. Uncertainty as NWC members shun Southeast meeting. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. MDA spends 16 billion naira on ESTA code compensation in 2 years, says budget. You can get the complete story on page 33 of the Punch newspaper. Lagos Assembly plans to probe Obasa for fraud. You can get the complete story on page 38 of the Punch newspaper. NEITI, EFCC collaborate to recover $6 billion, 66 billion naira crude proceeds. You can get the complete story on page 39 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story, National Conference, Federal government restates commitment to better Nigeria. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Farotimi, Afenifere, Obi hail Afe Babalola for withdrawing defamation suits. You can get the complete story on page 38 of the Punch newspaper. Gospel singer pleads not guilty to killing Nasarawa copper. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Punch newspaper. Dangote refinery to receive 12 million barrels US crude, says report. You can get the complete story on page 23 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Business Day, the leading story. Tinubu wants to drill Ogoni oil but clean up drugs. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. And beside the leading story from the right, Trump's critics from Bogota to the Arctic buckler under US power. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. Judiciary now biggest threat to Nigeria's democracy, says Atiku. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the newspaper. Aradel, MTN and other stocks to watch this week. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. 5 banks clear USSD debt as deadline elapses. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. Hunger in the land. How price of rice rose from 2,500 in year 2000 to 105,000 in year 2024. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the Vanguard. And above the leading story, banks close 1.92 million accounts in 3 months. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the Vanguard. I rely on rental income from my Kaduna house, says Buhari. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. 2027, I'm not interested in any coalition focused on grabbing power, says Obi. You can get the complete story on page 50 of the Vanguard. We will fight corruption, fix economy, security, says Shetima. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story, Catholic bishops to federal government. Nigeria's poverty, insecurity worsen. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. $6.9 million tax payment. Supreme Court dismisses Halliburton's appeal. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Defamation. How Oni, Yoruba monarchs resolved Afe Babalola, Farotimi's feud. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. 2025 AFCON. Super Eagles draw Tunisia, Uganda and Tanzania. You can get the complete story on page 55 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust, the leading story. Atiku, Nigeria on verge of losing democracy. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, I feed from renting out my house in Kaduna, says Buhari. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the newspaper. Nigeria has money to fund Tinubu's foreign trips, says minister. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. 2025 AFCON. Nigeria draw Tunisia, Tanzania, Uganda in Group C. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. And below the leading story from the left, what federal government must do to make currency swap with China work. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the newspaper. Afe Babalola withdraws case against Farotimi. You can get the complete story on page 11 of the newspaper. Hamas rejects Trump's relocation proposal for Palestinians. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. Gunmen invade Abuja community, kidnap man, wife, son, 2 others. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper on the list, Nigeria Tribune, the leading story. 13 million more Nigerians at risk of poverty this year, says report. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, 2027, count me out of coalition against Tinubu, APC, says Obi. You can get the complete story on page 15 of the Tribune. Amotekun arrests 300 suspects in 3 months in Ondo. You can get the complete story on page 11 of the Tribune. Aribesola's loyalists weigh 3 options after leaving APC. You can get the complete story on page 15 of the Tribune. And below the leading story from the left, court asks to stop Tinubu, NAS from sacking Omar as CCT chairman. You can get the complete story on page 22 of the Tribune. Salome's murder, gospel singer makes U-turn, please not guilty. You can get the complete story on page 11 of the Tribune. Southeast PDP rejects Damagun stakeholders meeting. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Tribune. Court restrains IGP agents from arresting Kanu anti-craft boss. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the Tribune. How Oni, Ewi, other monarchs appease Afe Babalola over Farotimi. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the Tribune. Ondo 2025 budget, hefty allocation to lawmakers despite hardship. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Tribune. Edun declares Nigeria's electricity sector open for investment. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the Tribune. Moving over to the last paper on the list, The Guardian, the leading story. Trump's presidency, US aid suspension may cost Nigeria $1 billion in health funding. Others yearly. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left, Shetima blames democratic failure in Africa on complex pressures. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. EU tells ECOWAS, find new ways to coexist with Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. Road crashes claims 5,421 lives in 2024, up by 7%. You can get the complete story on page 12 of The Guardian. 2027, more hurdles for opposition as Obi rejects coalition. PDP crisis deepens. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. How Oni prevailed on Babalola to drop defamation case against Farotimi. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.